Good afternoon, everyone. It's a very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us at the auditorium and a large number of our colleagues and friends across India and outside who've joined us online for this launch of the Schoolbooks Archives. Those three words contain within them a story of several years of an idea that I can see faces in the audience of people who had germinated that idea in our heads, that, hey, can't we have a place where people interested in school education at one place can find a bunch of resources with the least trouble and the maximum interactivity and the best user access, and have conversations around what exactly do we use in school education after for so many years, not just in India, but in the subcontinent, the neighboring countries, and other countries around the world. With those brief words that to just tell you that, or to kind of help you share the excitement that some of us have here today, in finally being able to put that slide up and say, okay, launch of the School Books Archive. It's been a slightly difficult, very, very challenging and quite long journey to get us till this point. What is also encouraging is that this is just the first step to a journey that's going to have to continue, not just within the universities with the faces that are here today, but possibly with people who come after us, because this is going to be something that takes on a life of its own beyond our lives, right? So, education obviously will continue and resources will be produced and used, and the need for having this kind of an archive would probably outlive our times, right? So thank you so much for joining us today afternoon, physically and online, for the launch of the Schoolbooks Archive. A quick brief of what we were planning to do today afternoon. I would be welcoming our Vice-Chancellor, Anurag Behar, to sort of open up the proceedings and give a few introductory remarks. He has been a consistent and constant supporter to the twists and turns and tales of the creation of the Schoolbooks Archives. After which I would like to use take a little bit of your time to just walk you through what is the archives, the objectives, the key contents, and how could people use it? How do you access something like that and use it for your purposes? And then we will follow it up with what we would hope is the first of many such panel discussions that use what we have in the Schoolbooks Archives to dig deep into questions about Indian education, the aims of education, and the role of school books in this entire journey, right? So more about the details of each of these later. I'd like to start off by requesting Anurag to take the podium and give us a few introductory remarks to set us off.
Hi, good afternoon. I am audible, I guess? Yes and no, okay. I'm audible, right? Okay, so those claps were actually, they were teasing me. Huh? That is not as most of you, outsiders, my friends from outside, they won't know this, but they're just teasing me, this claps and all the stuff that's going on. Good afternoon, and it's wonderful to be here. We've been at it for quite a while now, and it's been so long that every few months I thought that we've sort of launched it. Then I would discover that's still going on. Let me start by just saying this: that it's been an extraordinary effort. Absolutely extraordinary effort, not just from within the foundation overall and within that the university, but I think friends and colleagues in school education, outside school education, across different institutions. It is here because of that. And I know that it's going to be alive, vibrant, and it'll build bigger, better over a period of time because of the same thing. Because it's this extraordinarily, absolutely amazing bunch of dedicated people who've been working on this. So I want to thank all of you who are present here, who are responsible for this. And of course, I think many of my friends and colleagues who have been working on this who are not here, right? So thank you all. It's an absolutely wonderful thing. It's a quite a remarkable thing. But before I go there, and as always, I would like to mention 3 things or 3 points. Before I go there, I must also have a little bit of an inside joke. And the inside joke, those who get it will get it, which is the news floating around there is that why is it that everybody is here? Why is it that everybody is here? Everybody is here. Actually, I'm sorry to disappoint you, not because of this archive, but everybody is here because the dread that they have in their bones the moment they hear about Varda. Okay, so they're all here because of Varda, and Vardarajan Mudaliyar was famous, what he was. This Vardarajan is even more dreadful. So that's why everybody is here. Yeah? You can laugh. So, but, thank you again. I mean, it has just been absolutely extraordinary. I have seen, and Varda and Reshmi, and Varda particularly, has this strange and odd habit of sending me a WhatsApp at 4:30 a.m. and then wanting to speak to me immediately, right away, because he's discovered some 2 paragraphs of text sitting in, Asansol or some such place, right? So we've been through this kind of stuff for a bit, but that just tells me the excitement of what has happened here. So thank you again, right? The 3 things. The first is that, for the kind of work that the foundation does, it does not need to be stated why the Schoolbook Archive is so important. It is central to our work, absolutely central to our work. That is very obvious, right? What I'm hoping is what will happen is, not only as this thing builds further, we use it more and more in our work. And I'm just talking about our organization right now. And for us to be able to figure out how to use it more and more, I think it's very, very important. So I think that's the first point, right? The second, and I know that a lot of attention has been paid to it. I think we will continue to pay a lot of attention to it. The usability of something of this nature, right? And too often have we noticed that certainly in our country, but elsewhere as well, wonderful stuff is curated, created, developed, but inadequate attention is paid to the design of how it can be usable. I think a lot of work has already been done, and I think that should continue to be a big focus for us, right? That's second. Third is, I think, the Schoolbook Archive is particularly relevant for our times. And maybe somebody else will stand here 10, 15, 20, 100 years later and say the same thing. But certainly for our times, the Schoolbook Archive is very relevant because, school books clearly are representative manifesting of concerns, matters of great importance at that point in time, right? So as we've been going through, let's say, significant shifts in school books, as far as I remember, from the, let's say, the 70s and the 80s, and we're going through a certain kind of transition now, having this stuff out with us is perhaps a very important anchor on this particular matter. So whether it is history or whether it is, the sciences, what's happening with textbooks around the country and in different states, they need a certain anchor in the historical trajectory of how school books have progressed. And I think this particular archive will serve that purpose well. So with those 3 points, thanking again everybody who's worked with it, particularly Reshmi and Varda, Vardarajan Mudaliyar. Thank you very much and welcome everybody.
Thank you, Anurag, for both those encouraging and threatening words, so that the people who respond to Varda's 4:30 a.m. SMS continue to do so, right? Okay. So we'll move on to the second part of the program today. I'll just beg your indulgence for a few minutes now to just share with all of you here and online what exactly do we mean by the Schoolbooks Archives and how best to navigate it, because we would hope that the whole purpose of this entire enterprise is that it is used extensively, right? Okay, there you go. Right. The first question always, what is it, right? What is the Schoolbooks Archives? While a lot of focus has been given to the fact that it's an online, open access, curated digital archive, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that it is a bit of both, right? Physical archive is not helping me at all. Physical archive to see the PPT here. Okay, so it's both a digital archive and a physical archive, which is something I'd like to draw your attention to. Uh, the URL is obviously there, and it'll be available all over in our website so that you don't have to remember it. It's also fairly easy to remember, which is it's the Schoolbooks Archive at the Azim Premji University. So Google will help you in case you miss a few alphabets here and there, right? Now, the digital archive basically is a place where we have a collection of what we call school books and school book related documents spanning a period from 1819 to the present. Obviously, the present is a moving target. So therefore, the contemporary collection in active use in India and the subcontinent, the date will continue to be pushed as we move ahead. But more interestingly, pre-1989 resources, if we are able to find them and consider them worthy of being included in the archive, would push the dates on both sides further up and down, right? But currently, this is what we have. For a country like India, clearly, this requires us to cover books in all languages and all school subjects that have been written and produced within the Indian subcontinent. So India and its neighboring South Asian countries is our focus, which does not mean that we are blind to the need to also include school books that particularly are used in countries with a heavy emphasis on public education and that are known globally to provide a fairly good quality of school education, even if the cultures, communities, and initial conditions there are somewhat different from ours, right? So that's in a nutshell the reason or what we hope to cover over time in our collection. But apart from the digital collection, we also have a collection of physical resources that can be searched through an open access public catalog online. And these resources are held not just in the library in the Azim Premji University campus, but also several, almost 200 of our libraries that are operating in teaching learning centers across 7 states in India, both at the district and block level. And the reason for that kind of penetration is not just to make what we have available to the levels that we can penetrate, but also to make sure that we're able to gather resources from those areas. Not all valuable resources exist in Bangalore or Delhi or wherever, right? I mean, there are collections that are held by people that would be of great interest to our archives, which possibly are held in small towns and other places across India. So that's the reason why, the archive is not just a digital thing that you sit in your, with your laptop and navigate, but I would encourage you all to also, if you all are there in any of these physical locations, to also explore our school books collection. This is not just an Azim Premji Foundation initiative. A lot of partner organizations have worked with us, and they've been very sort of proactive in providing us collections that we can digitize, while the physical collections continue to stay in their library. So if you should go to, for example, Eklavya in Madhya Pradesh, large part of their collections is in this digital school books archives, but physically available in their premises and obviously usable. Right. The next question that I want to address is, fine, that's the school book archives. Why do we need the archive, right? Why build an archive? I mean, so many archives in India and abroad anyways. School books. What's unique is our focus on school books and not a general archive, either around a subject area or a region or a geolocation. These are no-brainers, actually. I mean, school books are obviously an important source of education and social history, and it enables us to explore, more importantly, for those who are not just interested in education as a domain, but for regular citizens to figure out how an evolving society sort of develops an understanding of what exactly is important knowledge that needs to be transferred intergenerationally, right? I don't think there are any manuals for that, and it's an interesting question to investigate in itself. Surprisingly, despite so many of us being involved in this area of work, fairly little research exists that are empirically based in the school books as they are used. So that there are debates and discussions around the aims of education, the pedagogy, and all of that. Not necessarily all of them are able to actually base their research on the actual school resources that are used, right? And that's something we hope this archive will kind of enable far more easily. One while Varda and I and many of our colleagues, incidentally, in the foundation who've done this whole time taking work of finding these materials to put them into the archive, without any level of overstatement, the level of danger that exists in actually losing many of these resources simply because they are dumped and some go down, or people who have them don't know the value of these things, is very real and very imminent. And so unless we are prepared to lose many of these resources over time, clearly urgent action is needed to sort of make sure that somehow or the other these are preserved, both digitally and physically. And yeah, the rest I'm skipping because obviously accessibility to these resources would help us across multiple locations, both for teaching, research, and curation, right? What will the archive facilitate? Clearly, a wealth of materials, not just as a reference repository for individuals and organizations working in education at the school level, but those who provide or create content for these books, right? More importantly, also those who then use these for teacher education workshops and seminars and conferences. Like Anurag said, while we've built it with a clear line of visibility to how usable all of this is going to be within our organization, it's pretty clear that this is usable by anyone, whether in India or abroad, for purposes of being able to explore these kind of questions about school books, their role, the best way to engage with them, their actual use in classrooms. And I really can't even run through the whole list of questions that we could explore. But that's something that we hope the archive will facilitate. Would enable chunking and bibliography work. Not everybody has to write a paper. Just putting together a bibliography of materials of interest is itself 10 steps ahead, right? So that is something we are looking forward to facilitating. And then a whole lot of bullet points that I won't read through, but evolution of script and language, pedagogy and politics, print history, not the obvious first layer of, use of resources in classroom education. All of these we hope would open up once the archive materials are made available to the wider public. From our end, we also look forward to research fellowships that actually use these resources to do some of the things that I have spoken about, right? Very quickly, I think a couple of slides and then we'll move from here. What do we mean by school books? I mean, textbooks, everybody understands. School books, I'm not claiming to have the definitive definition of that word, but for our purposes, what we hope to and have already started collecting in our archives is this following category of resources, all of which we refer to as school books. Printed books meant for use by student teachers and head teachers, which include textbooks, reference books, prize books, readers, guides, manuals, homeschooling children literature, solved papers, the whole gamut of printed materials that are relevant to school education. These are organized in a sort of usable manner into language-based India collections and international collections, right? Apart from these school books, which I've just listed, for us, school books also includes, for the purpose of the archive, a manuscript section, which is letters, correspondence, reviews by people who create these textbooks or write these books, right? So that's the second part, which we call the manuscript section, which would be looking at multiple approaches to actually producing these materials, right? The third important section of materials we would include into our expansive definition of school books is artifacts, or what is now more popularly known as teaching learning materials, right? So maps, atlases, education materials for children with special needs, all of these would come under this category of resources that we hope to cover. The fourth is what is not necessarily, does not necessarily come to mind at the first cut, a related documents section. Right? What are related documents? The entire political, legal laws pertaining to what should or should not be in school books, why have certain school books changed versions, all of that. So High Court, Supreme Court decisions, legislative debates, parliamentary questions, responses from MHRD, litigation papers, education policy documents, inspection and committee reports, clearly of direct relevance to what ultimately gets transacted in classrooms, right? Curriculum and syllabus documents, again, belong here because they provide the framework for what finally shows up in those school books. We also have a school books discussion section. So I'll show you, and very quickly, I'll show you the live portal so that, with a few quick pointers as to how to navigate it. But it's not only books, right? Or not only school books, but books about books, right? So writings on school books, journal articles on school books, discussions, deep-level discussions about issues to do with school books. All of this would also show up in the archives. We have an audiovisual section, which not only looks at lesson plans, classroom transactions, but interestingly, on the whole process and experience of making textbooks. So discussions with people, whether that's a panel discussion that's going to happen today, that's also going to go up there, but also individual conversations that have already happened around themes related to school books. We also hope, as we began to build this archives, we realized that we need a large number of people to join us with the skills and interests in this kind of archival work. So we'd like to have recordings of interviews with people who work in building these archives so that more people can learn and at their level sort of contribute to the whole process of archive creation of this particular genre of materials called school books, right? And finally, research notes, okay? So apart from the resource itself, we are trying our best to, for materials that really kind of strike at us at the first sort of cut, as something that is deserving of a deeper look or engagement, we try and write a research note that not only gives you an abstract of the contents, but also points out to what are the unique features of that particular resource. If possible, I'll just show you a couple just as a demonstration of where we're going with that. Right. Enough of me talking about the portal. I think it's time for us to just take a quick look at the portal. Here we are. So if you just type the URL, this is what you will see. A very simple academic collection of school books. Right. A few words about some of the things that you see in the top banner about the school books are, if it can be clear, yeah, pretty much a summary of what I have been saying for the last 10 minutes, right, of what is it. And clearly this is a statement that is not what we have right now, but what we will be working towards in the years to come, right? Let's go back. The policy section there, which we need not really look at now, basically looks at our approach to documents and making sure that within the legal framework of the country, these are shareable in an open and digital format with the rest of the community, right? The conversations on school books, I'm just giving you a deco on the top banner. These are the conversations that we hope to have many more of. As you can see, a little slower, variety of topics, right? Textbooks in colonial Bengal, in the Madras Presidency, historically located. Also, something far current, like the conversation Varda had with CNV, which was about the school book production process in India. What does that involve? Textbook production process, the politics, the processes, etc. So these are all fairly in-depth discussions. Many of these are videos that run to about 1.5 hours. A large number of issues are explored. All our users are welcome to sort of click on that YouTube link and at their interest on time, get these conversations. Also reach out to us if you would like to have a deeper conversation around themes related to this. Right. So that's CNV and Varda. I think we can do without that now. But yeah, you can just go on and listen to the 1.5 hour discussion on the school book production process. Right. So let's go back to how do you get the resources per se, the actual school books, if you'd like to use them. As you can see with the alphabet, they're all organized in language-based communities, right? So within each community, there are a whole type of documents. So there are textbooks, there are also any of those 6 or 7 categories that I showed you, all organized within that particular language community, right? So as you can see, a little slower on the scroll, unless I'm the old person here. I mean, I can barely read if it's going so fast, right? Okay. So that, for instance, is one community. if you're looking at the English community, it tells you, how many resources are there, and then you can also search. I'll just demo, because I don't want to take up any more time, 2 ways in which you can search among many others. What you can see on the right or on the top is the what's trending metrics, right? So the resources, where in the world are these resources being viewed? What are the resources? Not just so many views in India, but people in India are trending on looking at what? An education policy document or a particular textbook, right? All of those metrics with your time, as you can see, they're all listed by the type of resources that the community is actually engaging with. And that's useful information for people who are using it. Let's go back to maybe searching a language-based collection. We can leave the trending metrics for now in the interest of time. Yeah, this, for instance, shows you all the countries. I mean, as of today, it is publicly launched, and we already have these views, right? Other countries as well, right? So maybe we can take a look at the Malayalam collection. My team members helping on the presentation. Yeah. It shows you the bunch of materials. Obviously, those who can read Malayalam are going to be able to do this better. There's a reason I didn't choose English right now, because I mean, let's get familiar with the fact that many languages exist in India. On this, for instance, if you wanted to use certain filters, we maybe use a date of publication filter to just select, yeah, right there. For the Malayalam collection, for instance, if we should choose whatever, a pre-1947 period timeline, how would we do it? Yeah. So you just do your drag and drop or type. Look at this 1819 to 1947 period. Search, right? Okay. And there you have about out of 450 resources. Each of these would give you the listing, and then you can go further into that, search by subject, by grade if you want, and arrive at your interest, right? This is as much applicable to school books as it is to other materials like curriculum documents. We have a very interesting curriculum document, for instance, in the English community that talks about, a more recent period like 1958 and post-1958. Right, now this is just a lot. I don't want to, I mean, clearly this is something you can spend hours navigating to just look at what is of interest to you. As of today's count, we have more than 5,700 resources already up there. Our international collection has collections from several other countries apart from India as well. There are currently, I think, about 16 countries that we've managed to sort of start collecting resources on. Feel free to explore these. I'll stop here. There are some resources here which also have research notes of interest, but specific resources I hope will be picked up. I think we can stop here just in the interest of time, right? Can we go back to just our areas of collaboration? Yeah, right. So feel free to explore this. The types of documents within the term school books I've already spoken of. A little bit of clicking here and there, you can't go wrong. Will take you to resources that are of interest to you. If you should encounter any kind of trouble in finding a resource that is of your interest, just reach out to us. There's a contact us button there, and this is our SBA Schoolbooks Archives at azimpremjifoundation.org email ID. Our team will get back to you in terms of how best to get that resource. Moving forward, like Anurag said, like all of us realize, this is not something that a team of even 50 people can put together. Certainly are not a team of 50 people. We are a far smaller team. The only way to build this archive is through active collaboration. So the kind of collaborations that we are seeking as we build this further, collection development, write to us to tell us where you find school books that can be and should be added to these archives. 2, permissions, the whole plethora of permissions these resources. If we finally give up and cannot share them digitally, we will at least have them in physical spaces that you can access. But till our last breath, we do try and make sure that we can share them digitally. Metadata entry. As we're working, we find that there are so many indigenous languages that our team doesn't have the language skills to be able to classify the bibliographic metadata so that users can actually use them in their publications. So please write to us if you would be interested in working with us on that. Research notes, specific resources, deep diving into them and pointing out to others in the community why that resource is of interest, what kind of questions can they answer. Write to us, post it out there, and we will make sure this goes out to a larger community. And finally, without even asking us, please feel encouraged to use these resources in your outreach activities. Individuals, organization, teachers, all of this is available free digitally, also free physically if you would like to come down and access these, right? So with these words, I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your time. I know this was a bit long-winded, but I wanted to give you a sense of what the archives is. Like the team here knows, if it took us more than 4 years to build, it would take at least 15 minutes to explain what is in it, right? So that's about it. And after this, I'd like to welcome Sharmadip Basu, professor and colleague, we can get the PPT out of, to begin the panel discussion that I'm sure all of you have come here to listen into. We hope to have many more discussions like this. Sharmadip, may I welcome you to introduce the topic of the panel and also invite the panelists to join you. Right?
So welcome again, everybody, to what clearly is a landmark event in the institutional life of both the Azim Premji Foundation and, of course, the Azim Premji University as well. So over the next 90 minutes or so, this panel will explore various facets of the 200-year journey through textbooks in Indian education that the Schoolbook Archives captures. My name is Sharmadip Basu, and I teach history in the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University. And we have with us a distinguished set of panelists. And if I were to do proper justice to the range and scale of their achievements as teachers, researchers, peers, engaged public intellectuals, that would take up a major part of the 90 minutes or so that we have with us. Hence, my introduction will remain strictly topical. So right across from me is a person who needs no introduction to this audience in particular, but nonetheless, I'll attempt one. Professor Varadarajan Narayanan, not the Mudaliyar, but Narayanan. He's a philosopher by training, but a historian and archivist by passion. He's a member of the faculty of the School of Education at Azim Premji University, and had it not been for his indefatigable labors, it is fair to say that we would not have been gathered here to mark the occasion that we are doing right now. Next to Professor Narayanan is Professor Janaki Nair, who until very recently was a professor of modern history at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And currently, we are absolutely delighted to have her as a visiting faculty in the School of Arts and Sciences at our university. She's a prolific researcher and scholar across the fields of labor, urban, and women's histories, and she's authored multiple monographs, numerous scholarly articles, and writes regularly in the media on a range of issues. More pertinently, Professor Nair, over the last 2 decades, has been a keen observer and a critical commentator on the politics of and about history textbooks in Indian school systems. As you know, it's a lightning rod issue, it's a very polarizing issue, and Janaki has kept a keen, her keen critical sensibilities have bear on the development of history textbooks in Indian school systems. She's also been a member of NCERT's Textbook Development Committee and has contributed select chapters to secondary level history textbooks for CBSE board, specifically classes 8, 9, and 10. Seated next to Professor Nair is Professor K. Subramaniam, who also goes by the name Ravi, and I think I'll address him as that. He's a former director of the Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Bombay. An engineer and a philosopher by training, his work focuses on design and organization for the learning of core topics in the middle grade maths curriculum. He has published extensively on different aspects of school-level mathematics pedagogy, including possibilities and practices of its integration with out-of-school knowledge and exploring different roles of visualization in mathematics teaching and learning. Professor Subramaniam also contributed to the work of curriculum and textbook committees and to in-service professional development of teachers in different school systems again. And last but not the least, seated right next to me is Professor Rimli Bhattacharya. She's a member of the English faculty at Delhi University. Her interest as a teacher, scholar, and writer spans performance theory, gender studies, translation studies, children's literature, and primary education. A key site of her expansive range of scholarly engagements has been to track the evolution of primary school textbooks through the lens of print and visual culture, especially in the colonial era. And over the past decade, she's also been looking at the framework and pedagogy of the subject English in a comparative schooling perspective. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Before we delve into the 200-year journey of Indian school books, I will first invite Varada to talk about the shorter journey of putting the archive together. What were the original motivations? Anurag and Reshmi both have hinted at it. What have been some of the highs and lows, crests and troughs, points of frustration, productive encounters, so on and so forth. Oh, I just forgot to mention, for this round of introductory remarks, I'd request each panelist to keep their remarks to about 10 to 15 minutes in length. And I'll give you a hand wave to indicate the time.
Yeah. Before I start talking about how we started thinking about this archive, I also want to draw your attention to some very interesting pioneering efforts which in fact are very useful, very important in the domain of school and school education perhaps. And I think the reason why I want to mention some of these is because this initiative, the Schoolbooks Archive, is perhaps the latest entrant in that into that company, and there is much that we have learned from what these pioneering efforts have done. One is a website. The title of the website is Children's Literature from Bengal. And I think it is managed, the contents and everything else about that website is put together by Professor Gargi Gangopadhyay. It offers a mine of information concerning children's literature that have been produced in Bengal right from 19th century to the present day, and perhaps some of those titles even date back before the 19th century. It doesn't offer texts per se, as far as I know. I could be wrong about this. But it offers the title page, the colophon page in many cases, a description of the content of each of these books that have that find a mention in that, and also a very important element from a bibliographer's point of view, namely the location register. Now, we know that when you're thinking about school books, many that we would call children's literature have always made an entry into the school curriculum and so on. So that's a very important website. So this is entirely dedicated to children's literature. And then the other website that's taking shape, but though the work on it has been going on for quite some time, is the vernacular mathematics work that is being carried out by Senthil Babu and his friends at Institute of French Studies, Pondicherry. It's entirely dedicated to vernacular mathematics right from 16th to 19th century, with Injuvadi, Kanakadigaram, and a host of such texts, samples of measures used in context of veranda schools, but also sites of production and trade and business and so on. So there is amazing material, but then it is entirely to do with mathematics, but in languages such as Telugu, Tamil. I think they are now thinking of collecting and putting together such material from Odia and a host of other languages. So one is entirely for children's literature, the other one for mathematics, but the first one for children's literature entirely in Bangla, second mathematics in a host of languages, and then you have another website which is entirely dedicated. I mean, it began as a repository for historical material on Malayalam language, church history, and so on and so forth. But over a period of time, it has come to include a huge collection of textbooks produced and used in Kerala across subjects, across grades, and so on and so forth. So there are many such initiatives, and one way to think about this website is the Schoolbooks Archive would be to think about how it sits very well with in this company, and also at the same time by expanding the very scope to include not just textbooks but reference material, committee reports, and many teacher education journals for teachers, and a host of such material. It complements but also seeks to expand on the very possibility that an archive of school books may offer to all of us. Now this scope, and how this is what the scope of the archive should be, and how did we come to that, is a story that I would like to spend some time talking about. All stories that have to do with the genesis of anything, in the beginning there was no idea about books. An archive. We had a few books, and that's all that we had. But in 2014, we had an opportunity to to curate a very small exhibition for the annual partners meet of Wipro Applying Thought in Schools. We didn't have a lot of material. We had about 50 or 60 or 70 odd books. And given the nature of the meeting, this is only one among the many things that were going to take place during the partners meet. And most books that we had were, I think, were all from the 19th century, and about 10 or so from early 20th century. That's all that we had. And for those who had attended this meet, for a good number of them were very familiar with the kind of literature that was being written on the historical role that textbooks are played, and similar questions, but very few had an opportunity to look at these books and see what they contained, and or what they were like, who were the people who were writing them, what were the publishing houses that produced them, and so on. Now, while this did elicit enormous curiosity among a small group of educationists who had gathered for this partners meet, there were a few individuals who were attending this conference who were very well informed, and they had a lot of questions for us. I think that was the first major set of feedback that we got in terms of how to proceed further. One set of questions came from, in terms of, expanding the scope of this very small collection to include, fine, you have some books in Marathi, but would you have some books in Telugu? Would you collect some books in Tamil? Would you collect some books in languages, and so on? Different subjects. We had one or two books on sciences in Tamil. That was all that we had at that point in time, but people wanted those, some of the participants wanted to know whether it's possible to look for more material. Now, so this was one set of questions that we had, and but along with this, a very pivotal point for us, which I think when we were collecting, I don't think we had paid much attention to, was in terms of, if you among the books that we had displayed for participants to come and take a look at, there were Marathi readers 5, 6, and 7 from late 19th century. So one participant wanted to know, is it possible for you to collect, what the first Marathi reader would have been, second, third, and you can form a complete set, and thereby tell us, what curricular progression, sequencing, and so on would be. So that was one set of remarks that we had. And we did start looking for such complete sets. Not that we have always been very successful, but we have had more of this kind. The second set of responses, which had to do with most of the books that we had, given that we are talking about the 19th century, and many of them in fact came from publishers like Charles Serrao, Cooper Sons, and many others, and some from societies like the Vernacular Literature Society, the Calcutta School Book Societies, and so on. There were people who wanted to know who were the other publishers, were there societies, were there state involvement in textbook production, and so on and so forth. So there were those kind of questions as well. But along with that, there were also responses to the effect that perhaps the most pivotal body of literature on textbooks do not necessarily come from departments of education, but from history departments or historians of science and so on. So there were clear indications that, suppose you were keen to expand the scope of collection, collect more material, what is the kind of literature you should be looking at? And of course came several suggestions about people who are extremely well informed about such books, and and they also introduced us. There were many, Professor T.V. Venkateshwaran, Ravi Subramaniam, C.N. Subramaniam, Subbu, and many others. Now, we did go on collecting some more books in the light of the suggestions and comments we received from the participants at the partners meet. And about a year and a half later, when the Comparative Society of Education in India organized its annual conference in Bangalore, we had an opportunity to hold a second exhibition. By then, the number of books had increased to, I think around 300 books, and we could display them all. And that conference, it was a SESI annual conference, lots of young scholars with a wide-ranging interest, searching for all sorts of material. And there were people who had many questions, and also with that came requests if we could share this. So clearly, it did tell us that, look, there is a lot that we might be able to do for those who are interested in collecting such material. And of course, those who came for the SESI conference, senior educationists, they had their own set of suggestions about what to collect, where to look for, and all that. And some of them were even willing to give us a few books that they had collected over a period of time. And 6 months later, we had the third exhibition, and this time in Bhopal at the Regional Science Museum. Again, the number of books had increased. Given the space that was available for us to curate this exhibition, I think we could display only about 350 odd books. But there were a lot of students from different institutes of education as well as non-governmental organizations in and around Bengal who came for this event, and were looking at books and were quite curious with a lot of questions, and yeah. But we went on collecting. But for us, we knew that, okay, there is an enormous amount that we need to go looking for. But the question was, how do we do that? Yeah, fine. Okay. The second was, okay, yeah, we are talking about books, but there doesn't seem to be a single list or any kind of catalog which tells us, okay, in this particular year, so many books were published as school books and so on. So then we started looking at printed catalogs, for instance, the Blumhardt catalogs of the British Museum Library, which gave us very interesting indications about what kind of books were going on. But parallelly, we now thought that, okay, clearly, one person or a group of a small set of people collecting all of these books, it's just not going to be, we are not going to make a lot of progress within this. And we thought the way to go ahead would be to put together a group of people and form a committee, and also decide how do we go about collecting. Clearly, many institutions had thrown away books. Many institutions which should have kept them, had absolutely no clue about where they are, in what shape they are, if at all they are present in some corner of the building, and there were all of those issues. So by 2016, end of 2016, we had a one-day meeting, which brought together people to decide, okay, first one was, okay, should we go ahead with an archive of this kind, and if at all, whether it should be a physical archive or digital archive. Clearly, many said that it could be both, but many of them clearly said, because if you want this to be used by a wide variety of users, clearly, and not that everybody would have either the facility or the resources to travel to one location, a digital thing. And when workshops are held, textbook writing workshops are held, of course, participants who are writing textbooks need a variety of material to consult from. So clearly, the jury was out on having a digital repository. So that's one. But one of the things that also became very important, that this group sort of pointed to, was that textbooks alone should not form the content of this archive. There are many other set of documents that are going to be very important even to make sense of some of these textbooks. For instance, it could be a policy document. It could be a committee report that looked at the existing textbooks and then suggested. For instance, if you take the case of the Shimla Committee report of 1880s, 1890s, and we know that this committee, which was convened with Lethbridge, a very important writer of textbooks on history. They had asked all the provinces to take a stock of what kind of books were being used in different provinces and asked them to send detailed reports. And each of these reports were then analyzed, and then suggestions came about. And so is it the case that those books that were published and accepted or recommended by different provinces were informed by these committees' decisions or recommendations? So clearly it said that it did seem that, look, textbooks, yeah, they are important, as very important entities, but they might also be sitting in complex relationships with many other documents. Similarly, we know that by 1880s, a large number of books began to be published for the use of teachers, and many of them took as examples the school books that were currently in use, right? And publishers were investing quite a bit on getting such books written. So textbooks, committee reports, and these committee reports, have played a very important role even post 1947. In fact, one of the most exciting reports that we see was written in 1957 by none other than the great K.G. Sayuddin, documenting the procedures for the selection of textbooks in India. This was the first task that the Textbook Bureau undertook, and only a couple of years later, this organization became a part of the newly established NCERT. So there are these reports which tell us a lot of things about textbooks. And then teacher books meant for teachers, workbooks, atlases, reference materials, recommendations made by different committees on what should be kept in a high school library. The Bureau of Education, right from 1920, kept publishing these reports every 10 years. And they make for fascinating reading and tell us quite a lot about that. Teacher, one of the things that we don't see very often, perhaps they get published, are, from 1890 to 1960, 70, a lot of magazines that were published for teachers carried detailed book reviews of textbooks. If you look at the Indian Education Review published by G. Natation and Co., about 3 pages are meant for book reviews. And who is supplying these lists is none other than S.R. Ranganathan. So there are all sorts of things that are going on here. So this advertisements, books, textbooks being advertised, not just for specific titles, but as a publishing house, what is our take on the kind of books that we do? So this one-day meeting that we had seemed to tell us that, look, we have to have a lot more than just textbooks. That was the decision, and we slowly went about working on the archive, putting together, collecting material. We have had to do all sorts of things, some cases approach organizations which have been very happy to contribute to this, sometimes work in the libraries of older institutions, dust shelves, clean up books, make lists, inventory, get them for digitizing and all that. And we have also relied on a lot of digital repositories from where we have been able to collect a lot of things. So that's how it has been. And this journey will go on and on and on and on and on. Yeah, I think I should stop.
Thanks a lot, Varada, for that absolutely fascinating glimpse into the process through which what we see on screen today, what we saw on screen earlier, came about. And what stood out for me is the democratic constitution of the archive, in that you had almost real-time feedback from user communities and potential user communities, which informed the scope of the archive itself. Yeah. And maybe this is a thread we can pick up later for some conversation as well. The other thing that stood out for me is what you began with, the other existing archives. And maybe interoperability is another theme that perhaps we can pick up later. So let me now move to Professor Janaki Nair. Janaki, can you give us an overview of the historical trajectory of, history textbook writing in India and the politics surrounding that?
Let me first start by saying a very warm thank you to Varadarajan in particular and to Azim Premji University for honoring me by inviting me to this extremely important event. I mean, I cannot tell you that as a historian, nothing excites you more than hearing the word archive. And what we have seen, I think, in the PowerPoint presentation previous to this very warm and passionate talk by Varadarajan is this perfect and unique marriage of technology with this kind of passion. I could not have dreamed for something better. As Sharmadip has mentioned, I have had a long and deep interest in looking at history textbooks. So I'm going to confine my remarks, because it is a little short, number of minutes that we've been given to speak, to the subject field of history. Not to provide this synoptic view of the history of history book writing, but to single out a few kinds of issues that are true. As we all know, history is one of the most contested subjects in the public sphere in India, and contests over history books have been perhaps among the most fierce in terms of history book challenges. So I'm going to actually talk a little bit about that, focus on history rather than on other kinds of textbooks. Let me start right away by saying that history wars are not particular to India. So I want to place this in the context of history wars being waged worldwide. The famous historical strike of Germany in the 1980s on how fascism should be interpreted. The history wars, the term itself comes up actually in Australia when Aborigines began to challenge the way in which they were represented in history textbooks. Then, of course, there are more famous examples of Japan and equally famous examples of Palestine, Israel, Ireland, and so on. So what's happening in India is not necessarily unique to the subcontinent. It's part of something that is at the center of struggles worldwide. But in India, and I was really thrilled to see that you have a very wide range of textbooks in your collection from the 1819 period onwards. The emergence of mass education, of course, leads to a certain centrality of the textbook. And as Krishna Kumar has put it, in the 19th century, the textbook became the sacred icon of all required knowledge on the subject, rather than remaining an aid to teaching. So that makes a very, very big difference to the classroom space and what the teacher can actually do with the textbooks. And when textbooks get linked to exams, then of course you have an even further kind of tightening of the noose, as it were, that you have to master what's in the textbooks in order to be able to take the exam. But it should interest you to know that the textbook has been at the center of contention from its very origins. So my student Preeti, for instance, who has worked on the United Provinces region, has found instances of hurt sentiment being raised as early as the 1870s and 1880s, to which responses were made by way of changes to textbooks, and in particular to history and language textbooks. I myself came across a very lively exchange which occurred in Mysore state, which is the area of my interest, between a writer called Balakrishna Rao, who is clearly himself a textbook writer and a historian, and a history and geography textbook writer called Marsden. In 1906-1907, this is from the Karnataka State Archives, in which the argument was about whether the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are histories and not merely epics as they had been depicted in the textbook. And Balakrishna Rao was able to make this very strenuous argument for altering the way in which these two epics were discussed in the history book, because he said it was not just a matter of talking about our history, because these are actual historical figures, Rama and Krishna and so on, but it is also morally very, very deleterious to the schoolboy who will read these kinds of textbooks. So various kinds of arguments circulating around what is appropriate to teach in the history book were occurring from as early as the origin of the textbook itself. So I'm really pleased that this archive is actually going to look at these related lateral field of, you know, what the kinds of disputes and discussions about textbooks as well. But what is interesting, and I think you'll bear me out on this, is that at this time, the kinds of people who engaged in these discussions and debates, and even in writing these textbooks, were intellectuals, writers themselves, etc. I would say the big difference between that moment and ours is the fact that we today have a multiplicity of actors who are challenging the textbook as, and I'm talking about the history textbook, as the single repository of the nation's past. And because it is the single repository of the nation's past. I mean, we have, for instance, very illustrious examples from Bengal, Barna Parichay and Sahajpat and so on, which have been written by extraordinarily talented individuals. But what has emerged today, and this is what I would like to focus on, is a growing gap between professional history practice and the textbook writing, between popular history and the academy, in which the academy is occupying a very small and I would say a shrinking space. So the challenge to the textbook is coming from a very, very wide range of sources, and only intellectual laziness will allow us to characterize these as all emanating from the work of the Hindu right. Believe me, it is not all coming from the Hindu right. The huge outcry, for example, that broke out in 2012 in Tamil Nadu around the section on my 2006 contribution to the 9th standard textbook on the history of clothing, that is to say the NCERT book, which discussed the breastcloth disturbances in southern Travancore in the mid 19th century, revealed that there are heated debates about histories from a variety of perspectives. What are the histories that we must know? What are the histories that we do not know and must now be known? What are the histories that we must not know? What are the histories that we cannot know? All of these were the questions that were raised about that chapter. And I really learned a lot from hearing and reading those objections, because they came from this multiplicity of sources. So I'm going to just very quickly outline what are the kinds of challenges that history book textbook writing faces today, and from where are these challenges coming. One, the challenge is coming by histories from below, but outside the profession. For example, community groups who are now writing their own histories and want those histories to be represented. Secondly, it also comes from challenges posed by the state's own obligations to its constituent groups and communities, as happened, for example, in 2018. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. The Tamil Nadu government introduced this category, which we all now use, called BCE, which was before the Common Era, rather than saying Christian era, before Christ. And that was objected to and finally withdrawn as a something that would hurt a constituent community of Tamil Nadu. There are challenges posed to the multiplicity of truth claims, including those that are supposedly based on science. So this is something we are increasingly hearing, that history as a subject can no longer be trusted to historians, but we have to have scientists who will tell us whether there was a Saraswati, what the links between the Vedic Aryans and the Harappan civilization was, and so on. That historians can no longer be trusted to give us the answers to these questions. And of course, we have at the heart of it also this pedagogic challenge, which is posed by the demand in our textbooks for unthinking quickness, for recall rather than reflection. This is what our tests and examinations are all about. How quickly can we recall what we have learnt in our school year? I'll just give you one example of a standard 9 history textbook, which is currently in use and which is now being examined by a committee to see whether and specifically the committee has been asked to see if there are any contentious issues in these textbooks. So their brief has already been laid out. But I'm going to talk about a very non-contentious point to make the more pedagogical issue about what is it that our history books do and what can we do better. So this is what that history book says. It says, during the period of the Vijayanagar kings, temples were built in Sringeri, Hampi, Lepakshi, Karkala, Moodbidri, Bhatkal, Chidambaram, Kanchi, Kalahasti, Nandi, Sri Saila, Kolar and other places. So that's a long list of names. And it goes on to say that Sringeri is among the most unique, and it does not elaborate much on that. Now, if we can turn this around to be less about what and when, which is what normally people associate history books with, but rather the importance of why. So even this information can be put across to the child in a more challenging way to ask, for example, what did temples signify about state patronage of religion? What did they say about the idea of tolerance? What does it tell us about the wealth of the donors? And what of the artistic styles and skills and virtuosity? These are the kinds of questions we could well ask instead of just simply listing these temples. But of course, that is exactly what the textbook focuses on. Having said that, we are now also at a very unique moment, because we all know that we are part of this information age. We are surrounded by a surfeit of information. In fact, I would say it's a monstrous amount of information that ordinary human beings, certainly I, cannot process very easily, that is available on the internet, on the social media, and so on and so forth. And I believe this is a very serious challenge to the textbook per se, and to history teaching in particular, because the textbook is in some ways obliged to get out of this iconic status that it occupies. And therefore, I am suggesting, in what's left of the time I have to me, the possibility of the textbook actually not being a purveyor of information, especially in a subject like history, because that information is now so easily available, but rather a way of teaching students ways of thinking historically, a method. What is the way in which you think about this material with which we are surrounded, in which we are drowning, I would say. So I would say the building of this historical temper, I have been using this term now for some time to discuss what I think is this historical method, is one of the most urgent tasks of our time. And I believe that the NCERT books of 2005-2006 were an important intervention in this direction, because they did 2 or 3 things. And if I can just list 2 or 3 of what they did for the history textbooks. Excuse me. They acknowledged, to start with, that there is no single teachable, usable past. It's not anymore possible in a country like India, given the sheer expansion of historical research, given the fact that there are groups and communities, languages and ethnicities, regions, and so on and so forth, which have produced their own histories. So Indian history now embraces, and I think those NCERT books did a decent job of representing that, regions, groups, questions, languages, and therefore it was among the most inclusive exercises in textbook writing. Secondly, it also showed students how historians think, because it confronted students with the relative inconclusiveness of historical conclusions. So sometimes, for instance, you would have primary sources in boxes that students were themselves asked to think about, and they might have been contradictory primary sources. How do you think about a primary source that appears to be saying 2 different things about a particular moment, a particular event, a particular process? It also, therefore, engaged, and this is the third point I want to make, I think more fully with questions like, with illustrations, for instance, which is something which, you know, you don't take very seriously in a school textbook. You just bypass it, either the map or the map is still something that you can get an exam question on, but illustrations more rarely. But that set of textbooks did try to engage with illustrations more centrally as well. So when I say historical temper, what do I mean? I'll very quickly run through this. How do we distinguish a plausible account from pure fiction or invention? And I think this is a very, very useful tool that students should learn today. Is there a link between claim and evidence? And if so, how do we detect that link? Should a historical narrative take into account multiple accounts and perspectives? How? And if so, how do we accordingly alter our understanding of history? And countering unthinking recall with questions that encourage reflection. I don't have time here to tell you how marvelous the Eklavya effort has been in the production of alternative textbooks, but I'll just read one question. So it's a question which comes after a discussion of Aurangzeb, who's easily one of the most controversial rulers of India, and especially today. And the Standard 8 textbook asks this question. It says, Aurangzeb took some steps against the Hindus and some in their favor too. Give 2 examples of each. Now, I cannot think of a better way of encouraging students to see that these are not figures to be, condemned, but rather figures to be understood. And if so, what are the kinds of decisions they are making that actually seem to go in both directions? How do we introduce students to primary sources? How can they be read and analyzed? And how important is historical context in understanding contradictory, inflated, or even conflictual pasts? I have, in passing, mentioned that we need a museum to conflictual pasts, because easily our country is one of those that has among the most conflicted pasts. And I can give another example from an excellent series of books that has now come out in Kerala, which references a very well-known Malayalam poet, Kumaran, on the importance of freedom. And from that poem, it takes you to a history of the idea of freedom, not just in India, but worldwide. And I think that's a really imaginative way of introducing a student to ideas of freedom. And likewise, the Kerala textbook also uses maps in very interesting and unique ways. And I really urge you, if you get a chance, to look at some of these Kerala textbooks. Now, so I will end here, since I've already received my signal to terminate my talk, by asking one important question. In a country like India, which is over-exercised over building a common neo-nationalist narrative, especially today, can one make an argument for being Indian without being nationalist? Is there a possibility that our history books can tell us about what it is to be Indian without necessarily being nationalist? I believe that the 2005-2006 NCERT books went a long way in making that move. And I'm really glad that there is an archive now, because I fear that these textbooks are not going to be continued hereafter. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Janaki, for ending, especially with that provocation. Provides plenty food for thought. A couple of things that particularly stood out for me is the question you raised regarding the new information order and the status of the textbook in the new information order. And it reminded me of something that the media theorist Marshall McLuhan had mentioned in 1962, standing at the threshold of what was to be the digital revolution then. And he made the argument that the print is a 19th century artifact surviving into the 20th century. And perhaps we feel the full force of that particular provocation that McLuhan placed in 1960s only now. What is the status of the book form in our times? And maybe that's something that we can revisit, that question. Without further ado, over to Ravi. And Ravi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sharmadip, and thanks to Azim Premji University, Varda's team, including Reshmi and others, thank you for inviting me and having me here. But more importantly, thank you for this work and putting all this together. It's a wonderful resource, and inviting me has given me a chance to spend a few hours browsing through the archive and reflect on that experience. So part of what I'm going to say is what I've done in the last few days, looking at the archive, getting quite interested and involved in it, and trying to reflect on that experience. But of course, I must also give this warning that it's very engaging. So it comes at the cost of missing some deadlines. So if you have, so just a warning. But I think it's a wonderful thing to have out there, and a great resource. Also makes me wonder a little bit about the life of digital archives in general, and this one in particular. Maybe I'll come back to that at the end. So let me sort of tell you or present you something that I thought about. Of course, I'm not an expert in history or the history of textbooks, although I'm very interested. My work is mainly in the mathematics curriculum and topics around that. A little bit marginally, I've been interested in science because of the work of my colleagues at the center, but more mathematics. And I've had occasion to look at mathematics textbooks from earlier periods. I'll mention something about that, both in the 20th century and also some in the late 19th century. Okay, so those slides are primarily for me to remember what I wanted to say. They're not very interesting or important for the audience, except maybe a couple of pictures that I'm going to show at the end from the books in the archive, in the APU archive. So let's move on to the next slide. Let me see what I wanted to say. Okay, this is just a reflection that, it's very, like I said, engaging. You can get sucked into it, this whole business of history. Just the very fact that it's both strange to us and the fact that it's so close to us, it's in some sense a part of us, that we get very engaged. But I think it's also good to think about why we study history. And for me, the interest in history, or I keep telling myself this, checking myself that, look, it's to illuminate the present, to strengthen our understanding of the present, and to possibly help us move towards our collective goals. So the study of the history of school books is linked to the broader goals of education. And what are these goals of education? They've been formulated differently at different periods of time, and also by different people. The latest national policy will formulate it in a particular way. If you go back to earlier, the Kothari Commission or the important documents, they will say, more or less, one thing about these documents, they all seem to say the right things, and all the things are said, but you can see that the emphasis is somewhat different. There's a nice analysis of this, by the way, from the point of view of the mathematics curriculum in an article by Farida Khan, especially in the post-independent India on the mathematics curriculum and its broad goals and policies. So for me, the most important goal of education in our time and in our context, I would say, is social transformation. And that I say this also because it doesn't get emphasized sufficiently in many of our policy documents. They seem to shy away from that. I think this, in my view, should be foregrounded as perhaps the most, if not one of the most, if not the most important goal of education. And of course, does the education contribute to equality? Does it contribute to empowering the marginalized? These are important issues. And I place also reflections on the mathematics or the science curriculum centrally in that question. So it's important to ask that, because especially for science and maths education, I think it's linked to developmental goals, to practical or rather trajectories for mobility and so on. So that's sometimes gets underemphasized, but I think that's very important even for the STEM curriculum. So let's go to the next slide. Now, history is somewhat paradoxical, why go into the past if what you're interested in is breaking free from the burden of the past and to break out into the future? And it's paradoxical because the study of history does in some sense contribute to emancipating oneself, from the burden of the past maybe, and from the present. So it does this, I think, in two ways. One is a critical function. It shows how the inequalities of the present are sediments of past actions and therefore not permanent. It also highlights difference and possibility through its strangeness. So the distance and the strangeness may suggest to us some things that we may still reach out to in the future and by changing the present. So the study of historical school books for me is an important and integral part, even a necessary part, I would say, of curriculum development and research in our times and in the present time. So that's the way I come to it and I relate to it. And let's go to the next slide. So the school curriculum, instructional and policy background in the British times. So the colonial period is somewhat well known and understood because of the large amount of material primary sources which are available and the large work of historians who worked in this period. And so there's no need to recall all of that, but just to sort of my own purposes. By the way, there's a nice summary of this for the mathematics curriculum, particularly with an emphasis on the college or university mathematics by an article in an article by Dhruv Raina, which is published in a handbook of the history of mathematics education, which is an international collection of essays. So the broad institutional characteristic of the 19th century education has been sort of well understood. Perhaps there's some correction needed to that. It might further work of historians might show that. But broadly, it's that the goals were to develop a cadre of educated Indians who would serve the purposes of administering the colony by the British. And perhaps at some point it would have also been important from the goal of civilizing Indians into European modernity or into other aspects of the European culture and perhaps even religion. So this is the broad goal. If you look at this changed, of course, in post-independent India, at least in the explicitly stated goals, and especially for science and mathematics. In the post-independent India, it's linked closely to the project of modernization and of economic development. So that's really the main goal or the main policy context for reforming the curriculum. There are interesting issues related to this, which here and there you'll find in the work of some scholars who've looked at the mathematics education curriculum. One, in fact, is the neglect of the science curriculum around in the period just before the independence. In fact, it's one of the weakest parts of the curriculum inherited from the colonial period, and it led to the initial education commissions stressing this quite a bit, wanting to introduce quickly reforms and bring in new material and textbooks and so on in science and mathematics. Of course, in the post-2005, the roots of which go back to, in some sense, to the Yashpal Commission report and a lot of work that preceded that at the grassroots level, including the Eclavier work and many other groups. So that's brought about some change, and you could say that it brought to the fore a goal of individual development and growth, not just economic development of the country. And so it brought in a child-centered perspective to curriculum very strongly, particularly in science and mathematics. And I think it's there in the NCF 2005 and in some other curricula of the NCF 2000, not perhaps in the science and mathematics curriculum, but the goal of social transformation, social justice, democratic polity, and so on, emphasized also in the NCF and in the post-NCF period. And these have slowly percolated into reflections on the science and mathematics curriculum. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now that's the 20th century context. Now, if you look at the curriculum in mathematics, particularly, I'll focus on that because I don't know that much about science. The other scholars have worked a lot on that. So there was already in pre-British India in strong intellectual traditions in mathematics, astronomy, in science, in medicine, and so on. There were also well-established institutions of learning, including a large spread of schools. These go back, centuries, and they would have seen ups and downs, but they were there very much, and they were part of the culture with some differences among the different regions. And the British effort initially in the 19th century was to graft education, say mathematics education, for instance, onto this existing foundation. The books by, for instance, the famous books by Bhaskara, Leelavati, and so on, these and many versions of that, many derivatives of that work were current, well known. There were large numbers of manuscripts in circulation in the Sanskritic tradition. So the British said that this is not, and they realized, the initial researchers into this history, that it's not very different from Western mathematics, especially in mathematics, to some extent, even in astronomy. And so the idea was that it could be grafted on to this base. I think this was a process of struggle and negotiation. At some point, it seems to have been given up, and largely the effort was to translate books already written in England into the Indian languages. And so this was the, at least from the side of the colonial government and its various institutions, and there were many of them set up for purposes of production of textbook and so on. So this was the, so to say, the government side of the story. But if you look at the books, there were many books written by authors who were teachers, mostly Indians, and who tried to interpret mathematics in sort of regional, local, or vernacular idiom. And these are very interesting, I think. And I'd just like to mention a couple of books. I think it's coming on the next slide, but I'll say it here. We looked at some textbooks in Marathi. My colleague Aloka and myself, Aloka Kanere, some about 10 years ago. And two textbooks in particular we looked at in some detail. One was by Podar in the 1890s or so, and another was by Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who, as you know, is a major leader of the Indian National Congress. He was a mathematics teacher, and so was Bal Gangadhar Tilak, by the way. Both were mathematicians. And Gokhale wrote a textbook in elementary mathematics for schools. And it's very interesting because word of mouth has it even today in the Pune and Maharashtra circles that these textbooks were very popular. It's very hard to get copies of them. We just got a copy of part 1 of that book. And in this book, Gokhale actually introduces what are called some kind of rationales for arithmetic operations, which is not there in other texts. In the Podar textbook, it's not there. It's by and large present an algorithm or a method and get the children to remember it and practice it and so on. So Gokhale, on the other hand, mentions what he calls upapattis. After each operation, he gives a justification or rationale for why it's done that way. And those actually today, looking at it as a person working in maths education, is something that I see is so important for teachers as part of what we call pedagogical content knowledge. And it's remarkable that in the 1880s or so, when these books were written, 1880s and 90s, that they were there, and some of these textbooks. So this is part of what's interesting to discover in the textbooks in the earlier period. Now there's another kind of angle to this, which is that the old textbooks, which we know about a little bit from the work of scholars like Senthil Babu, are very different. Those which were used in pre-British times, the mathematics manuals, the kind of derivative works from the Sanskritic tradition, the ones in the vernacular languages like the Enchuvadi and so on. All these were give us some insight or some glimpse into the possible pedagogy and what in a major part of the 19th century, particularly the second half, in integrating these sort of traditions to what was coming in from outside. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Now, this is some comments about the curriculum reform in independent India, particularly from the perspective of mathematics education. Now, of course, the context for reform is both the setting of national goals, but that can be a bit misleading because the setting and resetting of national goals is happening in virtually every country which became a state of its own, which acquired independence in the 20th century, particularly the Second World War. And many of these processes are very similar across different countries, and they're largely influenced by international trends. So it's important to see that both, not just the national goals, but the international trends are influencing reforms in the curriculum. This is true especially of the mathematics curriculum. And in particular, there was a very strong wave of reform following the new mathematics, which was sort of an approach to mathematics developed in the early 20th century in the mathematics community, which percolated down to school textbooks and the school curriculum after the Sputnik sort of event, which rattled the West because the Russians seemed to be ahead of them in mathematics and science, which they didn't believe earlier. Suddenly they had put up a spacecraft, which the Americans were not able to do. I think they're in a similar situation today with respect to another country. So anyway, that's sort of shook them up, and the response was to bring in the latest and the most modern trends in mathematics into this curriculum, school curriculum, which was a bit of a disaster because it didn't work. And this even reached India, I think largely via the NCERT, which had already been set up in the late 60s. And so this was a new and important influence, the new mathematics reform of the 1960s. Another major influence was Piagetian constructivism, which believed in construction through activity, meaningful engagement with materials, also drawing on other traditions like the Montessori schooling tradition and others. So this also came into the textbooks, and particularly in the 1960s, I'll show a picture of that, of materials. So working materials in order to illustrate concepts. So this is very much in the Piagetian tradition, and specifically the work of Deans, British maths educationist, education researcher, thinker, seems to have influenced India with the presence of Deans. I think the battery is giving up. Yeah. Okay. All right. Which means I should finish fast. Okay. Yeah. So that's another kind of influence, and the social constructivism, together with the goal of inclusion and social justice, is a more recent influence through the work done in ethnomathematics and so on in India, and that's also quite an important trend. So this is more recent. Let's go to the next slide. And okay, the more important question is okay, this slide should have come earlier. I think the policy and institutions interact with actual curriculum development. I think this is where the archive will illuminate quite a lot on this interaction, which we don't know a lot about because we haven't studied the textbook material and the curriculum and so on. Let's go to the next one. Okay. So we looked, as I mentioned, quite closely at the Maharashtra textbooks from not just the 19th century, which I talked about, but also from the 1970s to up to 2000 or so, over a period of 30-40 years, and looked at how the pedagogy and so on has changed. It's very interesting. And these books are available, by the way. I'm not sure how many of them are there in the archive. I haven't had reason to check, but they are all published by the Bal Bharati, or the Textbook Bureau of Maharashtra, which is based in Pune, which itself I think is an interesting story that I have not read about, because it comes up exactly after the Kothari Commission and through the efforts of J.P. Naik, but I don't know where this is documented. So that needs some documentation as well. And these were some questions we asked, and let's go to the next slide. I'll sort of skip through that. We looked at three different kinds of issues. One is the specifically because this is an ocean and you have to choose a small slice and see what insight you can get out of that. Representations used for whole numbers. That's all that I'm going to talk about today in the next couple of slides. Then, as I mentioned, we looked at rationale for addition and subtraction procedures, including the carryover, the borrowing, etc., how it's dealt with in the different books, and particularly the meaning and of the division operation, how that's introduced. Again, very interesting. I'll just say a little bit about that because I'm not going to come back to it. The division operation is particularly hard to teach in the primary grades. And if you look at the meaning of division, this comes up in the earliest textbooks in the 1970s, but seems to disappear after that. And the story is somewhat similar also with fraction operations. So there's also, it's not always a progressive thing, but it's also a loss of some quality and some very useful and insightful pedagogy. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the primary level textbooks from 1969 to 2007, which we looked at, all of them used concrete representations to show units, tens and hundreds, which all of us are very familiar with, those who are exposed to maths education particularly. But they're there from 1969 onwards, so this is a bit of a surprise. In Maharashtra, Mani and Mala, the most common things. By the way, there's something interesting which I'll not talk about now, but maybe another time, is that the spike abacus, which shows beads on a spike, is it's the only one which talks about the positional value as opposed to the grouping principle. Now that's there in the 1969 book. It disappears after that. So this is again very interesting. So why does that go away? And as I mentioned, Dean's blocks appear from about 1979 and they're used very extensively in the 1989 book. So these are kind of waves of reform ideas which come and sort of ebb away. Okay. So another thing to mention is that the concrete representation for place value, additions, etc., are there only from the 1960s, late 1960s. Nothing of that in any of the books that I've seen earlier. And that's very helpful because I saw quite a few in Malayalam, Kannada, and so on. Nothing is there. Only numerals, all you find in maths text. Interesting book in Kannada from 1959, which I'll talk about and stop there. So let's go to the next slide. This is a book showing the units, tens, hundreds from a Kannada book from 1959. So that's really early. Let's go and the spike abacus is also there. Okay, so this is the last one that I wanted to show. Thank you. So this is a textbook from 1959, as you can see, and it's a book in Kannada, and the title is Mathematics for Daily Use. It's the period when a lot of changes were being brought about in India, post-independent India, in the world of measurement, metric units, the change of the currency. In fact, I think new currency was about to be introduced. There's a period when both the old and the new were used, and the authors mentioned that in the preface. And the things which are shown are the new weight measures which are going to be used. Similarly, other decimal-based measures, metric systems. So this is introduced, and this book takes a very measurement-centric, which was very prevalent if you look at the books in the previous century, but which are not there by and large in the 20th century textbooks. What's called new arithmetic, all of them say Naveen Ganit or some such thing in their languages. And this new arithmetic has a very number-centric approach as opposed to a measurement-centric, and that has implications for connections with daily life, which is again very interesting. So these are some reflections. I'll stop here. I think that's the end of the slides. And just say, I just wonder, we are now looking at textbooks and manuscripts which have come down to us over last 300 or 400 years. The digital archives that we set up today, are they going to last that long? And will researchers have access, thinkers, whatever, have access 200, 300 years down the line? What does it take? So I think these are good questions, and perhaps also important to build a living archive in some way. And I'm sure the archive will itself go through many phases of life. Now it's the phase of taking birth and growing and standing up on its feet, I suppose. But if it's got to be a living archive, then it seems that practitioners like teachers and so on should be involved in it in some way. And how does one do that? I don't know, but it's something that maybe you all might have even thought about. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ravi. I don't have to formulate a question out of your presentation because you've done it for us. And thank you so much for that expansive overview of the evolution of science and mathematics textbooks in India. And I'd like to invite Rimli now, who's worked extensively on children's literature, which in and of itself is a capacious category, and primary school textbooks directed towards children. So Rimli, over to you.
No. Yeah. So thank you so much. So I must say, for me, this is like if there was an afterlife, this would be my afterlife. Because at the moment, there's hardly any communication with people about matters that matter. So for me, when Varadar wrote to me, and I had come here last in 2014 to the other campus, I really thought this is my afterlife. And something that I have dreamt of, that there is this virtual and real space where, but then I thought, is it Borgesian? It's something like from a Borges' story, where everything in all the languages, known, unknown, dying, getting born of the subcontinent, and then, of course, all our neighbors, and to do with textbooks and anything to do with teaching, learning, and then all the other categories that came, which for me seems natural. But, is it at all possible? And then I remembered this short film, which if you have the time, just look at it. It's a brilliant little short documentary by Alain René, spelled with an S. It's called All the Memories of the World, Toute la Mémoire. It's about the National Library of France. And, it's one of the most philosophical films I've seen on the very concept of human knowledge. So yes, so that's why I felt like I was, I had been reborn as a little bubble in this ocean of Maya, if you like. And then, of course, I came right down to earth. And I think I'm the only one who's actually brought some books to show you. And I'm really going to talk about, and you'll, I hope, give me my 14 and a half minutes. But warn me when that is over. Yeah. So I'm going to really focus now on the question that was asked, the three questions that were asked to us, and try and really answer them through literature and what might be considered the literary, because that itself is a big question. Is literature just, can there be, for example, the subjective in mathematics. I know I'm like gearing myself up for a crucifixion or a lynching, or in history, you know, where is the narratorial voice? But in history, I think this has been talked about and so on. So I think the textbook, the school book archive falls within the domain of print culture. But I think we have to think of it as an independent domain, precisely because of the overt and implicit political debates and ideologies it needs to be located in, both past and present. So I'm going to speak very synoptically, point by point, and I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so if you want me to come back to something, I'll be happy to do so. I think the unique thing about the subcontinental school book culture or phenomenon is the sheer scale. I don't know of any other, if you think of nationwide studies, for example, where this has happened. The sheer numbers, and this is just not today. And I will give you a classic example from what I call a bitter battle of the press. Who's going to control the press? Literally, they used to call it yantra, the jantra in Bangla. I'll give you a very concrete example from that. The other important thing which has come up several times is how do we locate this in its trajectory between the policy and the praxis? So that definitely the policy praxis continuum is what is overarching in this archive that's coming up. And the third, I think, general point I want to make is that probably the printed textbook until today, even now, and even in the so-called age of digital revolution, is probably the only book that the ordinary or the average or in fact the brilliant Indian child, but the one who is usually not in our ken, is actually going to hold and own and maybe throw away, but for a while that is probably the only book that they will have, the material thing, whatever book it is, math or whatever. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that it has this valence, this enormous value as materiality, as tactility, which no other book probably has anywhere, I can say this, in the world, if you look at sheer numbers. Yeah. And I had been studying, I'm going to pepper this with a few personal, not recollections, but work that I've been doing. For example, I was looking at French textbooks just before the First World War and after. And that is one of the reasons, in fact, why that library in Germany was set up, because you see it's today hard for us to imagine that there could be this level of stereotyping, caricature, bitterness, actually embedded so deeply and so systematically in the textbooks. About the Bosch, the German was the dirty Bosch. And so the very idea of the nationality, the national glory of France, patrie, was absolutely constructed. So this goes back to your point, Janaki, about not thinking of this exclusively as an Indian thing, but this kind of construction. But the important thing would be not to just see it as ye bhi tha, but what does it offer us now? Where is, one of the reparations, if you like, was to create this library without borders in Germany. So would this archive be something like that? But it cannot, and I'm sorry I'm being very vehement about this, or maybe polemical, but I don't think the archive can be a neutral space. This is something we haven't talked about. And I am making my humble submission and extremely passionate submission that we have to have an army of people, and we have to do it very consciously. This is where a major battle is going to be fought. This is, maybe this is not happy news for the university, that, hey, we don't want it to be a battleground, please. But yes, it can be a battleground without, guts and blood and gore spilling all over. It can be a passionate intellectual battleground, which we've forgotten what that is, and turned into praxis, in different ways. So it's not simply identitarian issues about which I have personally had tremendous experience working in textbook workshops all over the country, but particularly I'll give you two examples from West Bengal and Assam, and I'm sorry they're both from the eastern part of the country, but I'll make up later with another example. Assam has, I think, now 8 languages which are officially recognized. So this is something we forget. We think of the linguistic identity of the states, which itself is another contentious thing, and we forget that they are actually obliged now to print out books in sometimes 8 languages. Now, I'll give you one very small example. There is a language called Alchiki, which is actually Santali. It is a script. Now, in the 1990s, some person who was, I think, beguiled by my scholarly appearance said, would you please do a review of textbooks in Bengal? And I said, yes, I would be happy to do it, but I won't do it in Delhi. So they said, why? I said, because I have to see where those textbooks are being taught and what's happening with them. Anyway, to cut the story short, West Bengal at that point claimed that it was the only state which actually had a primary school board. Apparently no other state had. So they said, this just proves what Bengal thinks today, the rest of India thinks tomorrow. This is already when Bengal had slipped to I don't know what place. So I said, sure, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating or the payesh, whatever. So let me go and have the payesh. And they were very upset with this. Anyway, I did what I had to do. And then I was told, we are the only people who have created a Santali script. We are the only people who have created a Alchiki textbook. And we are the only people who've trained teachers because they don't know Alchiki. It was created next door. And today I'm bringing in a bunch of teachers and telling them, darlings, you've got to teach in this language, in this script. Anyway, I spent trying to track down this Alchiki reader. Believe me, it was nowhere to be found, least of all in the office of the West Bengal Primary School Board. So the production of textbooks, which emerged from a huge and necessary, so it would have helped the Santali children if they had a script which spoke to them in their own language. The reality was, all the schools that I visited, including in remote villages of Bankura, which I insisted on, so they appointed someone to keep tabs on me, like surveillance, watch out what she's doing. Everywhere the answer was the same. Some of the teachers said, yes, we did learn the script in a workshop, but we've forgotten what it is. Some of them said, our problem is we don't have a textbook. Another person said, we don't need the textbook because we more or less are going to use the Bangla textbook, but we are going to do it in Santali, but there are no students, and so on. So this, I think, these kinds of questions of languages and textbooks being produced. So for example, Bodo, this is my last example, so one from Assam, and Assam also has huge numbers of languages which are formally recognized. So Bodo, now you can actually do your doctoral dissertation in Bodo. You're allowed to do it. Again, I was in a language textbook. Again, some misguided person had invited me, didn't know it would cause trouble. And I found it was the most boring textbook which would put not just a child, which would put even our ever vigilant heads of state to sleep. So we said, well, then, don't tell me that this is all that is there in Bodo, because I know a little bit about Bodo because I have students who speak Bodo, and it's a tonal language, and it's got an amazing range of poetry. So I asked 2 young men during lunch break. That's where the real stuff happens. So I said, can you tell me, do you just tell me a poem that you know? And they told me recited this lovely poem without a pause between whatever we were eating. It was all about the different fishes swimming in the Brahmaputra. And each one had a wonderful name. And I could imagine this, So I said, why isn't this there in the textbook? And the answer they said in whispers, said, because the gentleman who's sitting there who's the senior most person on our delegation has actually written all those other poems which have gone into the textbook. And please don't tell him we told you this. This is reality. Okay, so my feeling is the archive should carry the tales of the text, the tales of this, and Bodo itself, and this is true of many Indian languages, from Khasi to Garo, they've gone through battles over scripts. With script, so Khasi was first written in Bangla because there were Bengali Mohoris who were doing the accounts for the Khasi chiefs. Then the whole evangelizing movement and Welsh missionaries. And so you have something else. And I'll end with the Khasi, but first let me show you my first book, the first exhibit. This is a brilliantly researched scholarly book by a scholar first and also my friend Shibaji Bandyopadhyay, and this is called Abar Shishu Shiksha, which means once more the education of children, Shishu Shiksha. And I'll quickly, in 5 points, give you some of the amazing things that he digs up. The first thing is, today when I was looking at the archive, the Azim Premji archive, the Schoolbooks Archive, I found that there was already a Hindi primer which had come out in 1839 from Calcutta because of the School Book Society being there. So that's another interesting thing. Again, going beyond the idea of the colonial metropolis, where in fact the first Hamlet in Armenian was, if you like, published in Calcutta. Not surprising at all. It has nothing to do with Bengalis. It has to do with the fact that it was what it was historically. So that, I think, itself constitutes an amazing kind of history. And Vidyasagar, who was mentioned earlier, his seminal books, and on which partly Shivaji's book is based on this battle of the printing press. So before Vidyasagar, there was another person called Madan Mohan Tarkalankar, forget about the long name, MT, let's say, who wrote these 2 texts which became bestsellers. And they were before. Shishu Shiksha was one, 1849, and 1855 is Borno Porichai, which is Vidyasagar, and which is the textbook that my dear mother tried to teach me from, and she would run away from because it's so horrendous, I cannot tell you. But anyway, that was 1855. So imagine my mother's teaching me in 1865 from Borno Porichai. But this book, and I hope someday it's translated into English, because it would be such an asset to the kind of work you're doing. He traces the text, the material existence of primers, authorial signature authority, the print runs in various editions, the fight over what we would call intellectual property rights, as well as the intervention of the colonial administrators in this entire enterprise, because they have a stake in it, both in terms of what is going to be called education, vernacular education, but also in terms of what is going to happen for higher education. So this idea of education as, somehow freeing you from, quote unquote, the barbaric Orientalisms of the past and getting you into some kind of modernity is the sort of larger ideological trajectory. But what Shivaji does is to look at literally every comma, every word, and also try and glean that is there a kind of narratorial subjectivity even in the most boring passages of grammar, and he does come up with it. And then that's his second book, the Gopal Rakhal dialectic. So I'm going to skip the rest of this in the interest of time, but just to say that MT, Madan Mohan Tarkalankar, and Vidyasagar went into this bitter battle in which finally Vidyasagar won, which meant that although when he resigned in protest against something from his official job, as one of the skeptical colonial administrators says, what does it matter to him if he retires? He's making like millions of rupees from his printing press. And if you look at the numbers of textbooks that are going out, it's like a monopoly. I'm going to move on. I'm skipping quite a bit because I had some stuff on, but I'll send you these notes because they might be of use. I'm going to move to the next guy called Mr. 5 minutes. I'll finish. One minute for each guy. Sahaj Path, that's Mr. Rabindranath Tagore. And I had the pleasure of breaching the bastions of the Rabindra Bhavan archives. I hope no one here is going to go and tell them because they'll never let me in again. But I had to do it over 20 years to finally actually see, because so this is not what an archive should do. They would say, oh, it's you again. This is what I would hear. And then they would say in a very loud whisper, it's that woman from Delhi, she's come again. But it was rewarding when I found this notebook by Tagore, which was when he was a zamindar. His father said, you know, enough of writing poetry, now you go and manage the family estates. So he was sent off to east to what today is Bangladesh. And huge amounts of hisab on one side. I've written about it in one of my books. And, you know, for the zamindari revenues on which all the grandeur is being maintained. On the side, a couple of lines of poetry, which he's trying out, how the meter is working. And on the side, the beginnings of a primer, which is actually going to be printed and published 30 years later as Sahaj Path, whose design, font, and layout, not to mention the illustrations by Nandolal, are hard to be matched. And I'm not saying this because I'm a Bengali and because he happened to be a Bengali. I'm just saying this because when you see the passion that goes into the making of a textbook by someone who has a completely different notion of education, and so who is not bringing out a manifesto, it's there. So would you keep that hisab ka khata in your archive? I would, if I were you. Yeah. In the 2 minutes that I have left, I'm going to skip this about master copies. I'm sure you know about that. So for example, in Gujarat, when I was there, I had to study Gujarati, otherwise I was told that I wouldn't get my salary, so which was a good thing, good incentive. So I learned Gujarati. And I was working with some tribals there. I can't remember the exact designation, from Chote Udaipur. And one of the things I discovered was that there's a master copy of a textbook, then the same thing is translated into, say, Urdu. And it doesn't matter that the Urdu script is written differently or it needs different spaces. So, you know, some words just went missing from the text. So this is another example I want to give of the textbook in progress, of policy being implemented in a particular way, which I think is again an original area of research. The last point, 1 minute, is I have to show these other books. So this is a Khasi book of Khasi nursery rhymes. And the most amazing thing about this is one of these rhymes which I had heard as a child, I grew up in Assam, was from the Aya, the caregiver of one of my friends, Assamese friends. And she used to sing this song to us, which I remembered the first line. So about 40 years later, when I went back to Meghalaya, I asked someone, am I imagining it or is there a song like this? And they said, no, there is a song like this, it's a hymn. And it's there in this book. And the interesting thing is, yesterday I found, or day before, I found this beautifully sung on YouTube. And now it's kind of a reclamation of Khasi legacy. So it has nothing to do with either teaching and it's sung almost in a rock and roll kind of way. It's very nice. If you like, I'll send you the link. And the last half a minute, you don't deny me that, is this. So this is the most probably difficult question I'm going to pose. So what about textbooks which are prepared and never go into print? Shibaji Aya and some other of us worked on this. It was called Khola Khata, which means the open book, play text. It got to the camera-ready stage. Then the teachers in West Bengal got very alarmed because it was too revolutionary. And they sabotaged that project. So we worked on it for 2 years. Somewhere, it must be there. I have some copies. So it never made it. And this, 30 seconds, is a book called Thebuwa. It's from a school in Soweto in South Africa, which was threatened with closure. This is post-apartheid, after it became a republic. Why was it threatened with closure? Because the children are not good enough. They're not performing well. Close that school down. So the school teacher and the students and another educator who is my friend, they worked together and got the children to write their own poetry in 2-3 different South African languages. And this is that book. And if you read the book, or if you listen to them perform it, because they don't just recite it, they perform it, you would want to ask, would this be a textbook? And I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rimli, especially for bringing into the mix questions of form, script, materiality, and books as a part, especially textbook as a part of a democratic material culture of certain kind, and what archive theoretically is, an externalization of collective memory, and what role does the archive have in order to serve that collective memory. And given the contestations over memory, it's not an easy question, and therefore archive definitionally cannot be a neutral space. And thank you for stating it that way. How much time do we have? Varada, Reshmi?
I think we have.
Another 20 minutes, so can we have one more round of questions and then open it up to the floor? All right, okay. So archive is actually a potential, and you need a community of users to realize that potential, otherwise it just remains as such. And I'd like to ask each one of you, and you can take it in whichever order you want to, what kind of user communities, having served the archive a little bit, do you imagine for the Schoolbooks Archive? What kind of user communities from your specific disciplinary locations or engagements do you think will benefit from engaging with this archive? Whoever wants to go first can. Yes, Ravi, thank you.
So of course, one obvious category of users is researchers, which many people have spoken about. The problem there is that my own experience in mathematics education research is that these things are not well supported. I mean, it's not that society is waiting for lots of people to come and do research. So the support in terms of people getting interested and motivated in terms of material resources, funding, etc., is somewhat scarce. And I think that's, of course, I was very sort of interested to see in your slide that you're going to put question papers on your archive, and that might actually be a good idea. And even students answer scripts. I think toppers answer scripts. I seem to have missed the bus. I wish it was there like 30 years ago, or when I was a parent at least. So anyway, so that's something that is going to constrain the amount of research projects that can be carried out. It's thin in India, I think. In general and in education research, I think it's not that well funded. So that's a problem. Now, in terms of teachers and so on, I mean, I've come across these science sort of archives in Bangalore, Science Gallery and NCBS and so on, where they have an interface where they ask to sort of put up a story, to use the material and create a story. So it seems like a nice idea. I can imagine a teacher browsing through the archive, finding something very interesting. Now that might be for the teacher. My battery is going off. It might be interesting for the teacher, but it might be something very well known in the community of historians, say, or historical researchers. But so there's got to be a dialogue between that teacher who found this nugget quite interesting and the others who can place it in a larger context. And so I think collective understanding will grow through that process. So this is another sort of thing. And these days we are into digital certification and courses and so on. And certainly I'm sure you're thinking along those lines of using the archive to generate courses. Just some random thoughts which came to me, thought I'll air them. Yeah.
Should I turn this on?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, if I can actually take some of what Ravi has said forward, I think that it should not be only for researchers, the archive. And, and I think you already have a vision that includes people who may be just interested and curious. And I say this because now I think in this time and day, the archive is no longer a location to which you go and you spend long hours turning over pages and so on. It has changed. And you will know it because you've already digitize, etc. Is there a way of drawing people into some of these documents with very imaginative questioning of, say, a primary document? That would be something that needs to be done, and I think very urgently needs to be done. So can there be a part of your archive which actually encourages anybody at all to take a sample look at one or two sets of materials, the kinds of things that Rimli spoke about, that you spoke about, and I certainly know from textbooks. Like, for instance, the early geography textbooks are like catechisms. And, so we know that. And could that be used to say, how is this subject developing? What are the kinds of facets that it shows, and so on, to draw people into the use of primary documents. So it need not be a researcher. Having said that, I remember the time when I came and tapped you on the shoulder and asked you for your collection of school textbooks, which you very generously shared. And I have to say that my students have actually used them. Because they are in this digitized format, I was able to share them with my students, and there is now some interest. I wouldn't say there's a complete lack of interest. There is some interest that has moved in the history of education away from policy and so on to things like looking at representations in textbooks, how are subjects being developed in textbooks, and so on, which is very new and exciting. So there is definitely interest in this direction. But my my plea would be that it may be made actually accessible to non-researchers. Perhaps in this way, in terms of taking up exemplary documents and discussing them with a set of questions, which will then draw people in to think, hey, I didn't think of that as a question one might ask of this particular document.
Yeah, my response is going to be a slightly detailed one. Of course, the historians of various things to do with education, that's a category, and who are probably very well versed with using of a range of research tools and so on. And the possibility, the potential that this may offer over a period of time, if not now, is anyway there. But I would think that this would be a lot of use in teacher education programs, teacher educators, students in teacher education program to look at different materials and so on. I think that is one thing. And teachers, of course. So one of the things that we have planned to do, and okay, the other possibility is when, now textbooks are, for the most part, no longer single author textbooks. Teachers, teacher educators, they all come together, and then there are experts from the universities. So, it's largely a group sitting together to write. And this being available in digital form might in fact offer a range of resources that may be used in such workshops when writing drafts, to think about multiple possibilities that in terms of treatment, in terms of the the very form in which textbooks get written. So all these are possibilities. And so one of the things that when we have had this exhibition, on two of the occasions we had Arvind Sardana from Eklavya visiting, and I remember he was there at the Waters meet as well as the SESI conference that happened in 2016. He was saying, look, this gives, if you do it well, he said, he was always warning us that the task ahead is enormous, but if you do this well, today you might in fact give a lot of people an opportunity to think that textbooks could be imagined in 100 different other ways. Not by, it might decenter the very idea that textbook has to do all of this. So it might give us opportunity, and there are any number of exercises that students in teacher education programs do with different kinds of TLM material. And of course, there are teachers who may want to consult, okay, how has it been done in another context or another set of textbooks, whether it is maybe another state, another board, or a non-governmental organization, and so on. So all of these are possibilities for me. I think illustrations are a possibility, and there is a lot there. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is that, look, it is not enough, if we have this archive sitting on digital space, that we must also go to a number of places, physical locations, especially where there are clusters of teacher education institutions, different set of organizations, and carry an exhibition from different place to the other. So the teachers, teacher educators, students in teacher education programs, SCRT, curriculum developers in school can come and have a look at it. It may be an exhibition of 400 books or 500 books, giving them a sense of the range, the different kind of materials that they can consult, and also how this archive could be used. And this may also give us enormous feedback in terms of what we should try to provide proactively, based on how it is used, the experiences, and so on. Sorry, yeah, it took a longer.
Yeah. I just want to add to what you're saying, Varada, that apart from the exhibitions, if the archive can also invite people who are a mix of the curious, the scholarly, and let's hope everyone is curious, but just the purely curious, the scholarly, and the textbook, potential textbook makers. Because there is, you need a certain amount of training to actually glean something from the archive. And so supposing you just wanted to take the treatment of a theme, let's say, how did people teach the seasons? I'm just giving an example. Or how did people teach about an event? What constitutes an event? How did textbooks work with it? So it could be very, very simple. It could be extremely complex and abstract. So my feeling is that if you can simultaneously, I don't want to use the word module, but samples, like seedlings of what could be, and I wouldn't know how to do it with science, but I can think of ways with, say, for example, environment, how it can be very interdisciplinary. So you work with a geography textbook, with a mathematics textbook. In fact, that's how I'm trying to think now of, I'm doing a project on the Indian Ocean, and I'm trying to, it's coming naturally in a way. So your archive can be an alternative way, especially at a time when information overload is a big problem and people are being forced to not read, not attend, attention span. So we can't speak of it in a completely idealized way. If you look at where we are now, people browse, people scan, people skim. But this demands a lot of attention. So how do we create very small, exciting, challenging, but not forbidding exercises, which actually pulls in thought from other people, their needs, their demands. If you could plan like a 2-year program of this, maybe whatever, but in a modest way, but which is not just the exhibition, but the exhibition bolstered, and have maybe some of these as resources on the web. Like, here's what you can do with da-da-da-da-da. Just like that. I find that that's very helpful.
This reminds me actually a curated set of documents that the British National Archives has put together called The Road to Partition for middle school students in England. And you can actually go browse through the archives and so something along similar lines perhaps, with textbooks and
student projects.
Right.
Which
Exactly.
They can then add. So they'll feel proud that they're adding something to the...
Sharmadip has made a beginning.
You made a beginning.
Sharmadip has made a beginning.
You mean right now?
Yeah, with the course that he's teaching.
Looking at history school books, textbooks actually. I think we should, at this point, open the floor up for questions from the audience, and if there are any questions online, maybe we can tackle a few of those as well. I know that we are running close to the end time, but still.
Yeah.
Hi, I am Srikanth. It's from a colleague of mine called R.S. Krishna. He's been watching the program on YouTube and he's sort of sent the question to me. He has 2 questions. I'll just read out both of those. Would this archive start a program familiarizing teachers and schools on the importance of textual materials as an intellectual heritage worth archiving in their own personal and institutional domains? What kind of challenges do you foresee? And one more, what kind, if any, criteria will guide the selection of material worth archiving in this archive? So these are two questions from my colleague R.S. Krishna.
I can probably say a couple of things about the first one. In fact, similar attempts are being, the kind of attempts that Mr. Krishna is talking about, something like that is already happening in different places. For instance, I'm with two very close friends, Advait Deshpande and Krunal Desai. We've been trying to literally recover from the state they have been in, a lot of material that have been produced at the Anandiniketan school right from the 1950s to the 70s. We in fact went looking for the correspondence that the Zakir Hussain committee received in response to an announcement in Harijan. We couldn't find that. But what we found instead was enormous amount of material, which includes teachers' notebooks, in those who were in the teacher education programs, the basic teacher education programs, those who were sent from different government schools in different states for extended periods of stay, lesson plans of correlated study, student reports concerning, the topography of places in and around Sevagram. There's an enormous amount of material. So we try, so there is an attempt to, thanks to Sushma Sharma, Sushma Tai's, characteristic spirit and the way she's been supporting, there is an ongoing attempt to, we have cleaned them, that's what we had to begin with, and then, put them in places so that at some point they could be sent for some kind of a treatment, because some books do need some repair. So that's, I think a similar attempt is being made now at different institutions. Okay, the second I would like to mention is what Suraj Jacob and Ajay Singh Mehta are trying to do at Vidya Bhavan, the number of institutions, the kind of experiment that they went through. One of the first institutions to introduce the Dalton Plan, and so on and so forth. So that's, so there are many attempts that are going on. And I think it is very important in documenting and not merely in terms of giving the institution a certain kind of an identity or, the kind of legacy that the institutions has had, but the variety, I think all of these archives tell you the possibilities that have been explored, worth looking into, and on the basis of what we see there, what else could be done. So I think it is a very important thing for institutions to have their own archive and get into this archival activity. The second question, I'm not very sure whether I have a specific answer to that. All I would say is that depend on what you want to archive, but the selection, again, I'm not very sure whether an archive should seek to select. We are all very familiar with the very famous Roymond colloquium in the 1960s, where it was all about producing a new edition of the works of Nietzsche, which led to the Colli Montanari edition. Everybody said, don't select. There are laundry bills, let it be there. Okay, so similar is the case. You don't know, what is somebody else going to come to that institution looking for? I don't know whether an archivist can predetermine, what should be. Maybe you would have to select some broad categories. But once you have selected, okay, this is the school book, this is going to be an archive for textbooks, I don't think it's a great idea to select, okay, these textbooks are okay, these are not so great textbooks, why should we have them? No, I think that may not be, but that's my answer. Yeah. So everything.
Anybody else wants to answer especially the second question?
Yeah.
Because it circles back to what Rimli had earlier talked about, the neutrality of the archive, and whether the archive can really be a neutral space, or there is a nosological or a classificatory logic that's always operating in the archival space, be it digital, be it physical.
Yeah, if I can just say something, the word archive itself comes from
Exactly.
kinds of selections that states make. So that is the original intention of an archive. It's a record room, and the state keeps and destroys certain other kinds of materials that it does not want posterity to. It either thinks it's not important or does not want other people to look at. So that kind of decision of what goes into the archive is something that is defined by states. And here I'm talking about official state archives. That's the principle that governs them. But even they have moved far away from that. So for instance, if you go to Karnataka State Archives today, you will find a very fine collection of private papers, and they include the private papers of political individuals. Naturally, that's where it starts, with the freedom fighters and so on, but also people who ran presses, teachers, artists, and so on and so forth. And it includes everything that they actually had in their possession, including, you know, press clippings that they might have kept, and so on. So, you know, what's the logic of their collection? That would be the kind of question they ask. So the non-official interest in the archive is definitely not to pick and choose. So I would actually go with what Vardarajan says, that we don't know what possible questions can be raised about things that might seem very ephemeral and uninteresting to us today, but might have some historical value tomorrow. So, yeah.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, I'm Nirmala. So the new education policy talks about equal emphasis to all subjects and occasional education and stuff like that, and also new and comprehensive national curriculum framework. But in real, teachers are handling children coming after 20 months or 2 years with lot of learning loss and missed learning. So does the archive help teachers or educationists to handle both the things, like the curriculum and the lost learning?
Anybody willing to take the question from the panel? Okay.
I'll try. Can you hear me? Yeah. I don't think I have an answer. I have thoughts about it, which is that, you know, this is something I've been thinking about every day, especially after many of the reports have come out, not just the Jean Drèze one, but others, you know. I actually feel that's why I said what I said, that you have to have a band of a huge number of extremely dedicated people across disciplines, across professional, non-professional fronts, who would take up this challenge, because it's not it's completely unrealistic to expect the teacher who's been turned more or less into an administrative clerk for most things to be able to handle this huge challenge. You know, I mean, recently there's been an article how teachers are resigning en masse in the US, simply because they found that they're unable to deal both with this, and it's so much better there than what has happened here. So my thoughts are, not answer, but my thoughts are, can we put together, and the archive as like this one could be actually a kind of nodal point, which would say encourage someone like me, who has, in that sense, I'm not on the ground, I'm not working with teachers, but I have in the past, and I feel I have some sense of the constraints within which a teacher is expected to work. So without diluting the whole question of what Janaki was saying earlier and what you were saying about can it be like a emancipatory thing other than just rote learning. And I'm thinking, for example, I don't know, we didn't talk about it, but I'm thinking of what Russia did, which was just incredible. I'm talking about revolutionary Russia, in terms of how they actually drew on many kinds of archives, you know, of art, of film, of everything, literature, and literally made it available for a population which had absolutely was illiterate, you know, and they could do it before the age of digitization and everything. And I grew up reading a lot of these books, and it's very hard to say which was a textbook and which is not. So a lot of my knowledge of Russian history has come from books which were not actually textbooks, and which were clearly polemical, no doubt about that. But so I think it's possible, but you would need a huge army of people of different kinds to actually see it, and it's not as if we didn't have those kinds of movements. In Kerala, you've had, in many places you've had, so it's not just literacy, but it's, so I actually think of short, even 5-minute pieces on YouTube. I think of like a range of possibilities. For example, I'm working a bit on rap in India, or what is being called rap. And many of them are useless, but many of them are tremendous for the kind of histories they compress and the visual power they have. So without diluting, I think it is possible to raise, to tackle what you're saying and many of the issues that were raised here, but it needs massive concentration of intellectual and coming together, collaboration.
Can I just respond very briefly?
Oh yes, absolutely, Ravi. Last one, and then I think
Yeah,
Reshmi's
just
gonna
to
go.
Nirmala, because I think it's a very important question, and it's sort of connected to something that I was trying to say, that we are interested in history because we are interested in the present. And in what ways can archival knowledge contribute to dealing with crisis? I mean, the crisis is today, right? Is it totally irrelevant? Does it have no value at all? I think one thing is that, historically we have gone through many crises. There have been famines, there have been disruptions. So I think there's a certain perspective. And the researchers who study these archives, I assume, some of them would be interested in the interaction. I mean, what happened in times of crisis to educational materials, where special materials developed. This could be something that, so it's not going to help in the immediate, but I think what your question does, I think, is to orient the interest of those who are doing archival research in certain ways. And I think that's why it's very useful. Even in terms of the selection of material, I think familiarity with the material which an archival researcher would have might help her or him to contribute in times of crisis to people like, teachers. Now there's a campaign, Jam is here, they're doing, what is the material we can use to bridge learning gaps which children are coming with into the schools, and where will teachers access this material? So an archivist could step in and say that, look, some of the children might be interested in this. So I think it helps to orient. Thank you. So that's my question.
There are recorded similar instances during the war in some cases. In India, during the Second World War, in places, and during just after the partition, when there was migration of people from one place to the other, there were experiments in setting up schools for people who were on the move and trying to settle down. So, for instance, the Hindustani Talimi Sangh came up with a specific curriculum for people, children, who had to move from places who had no access to schools and so on. So does that, yeah.
Thank you very much. We have to draw this panel to a close. Thank you, Rimli, Ravi, Janaki, and Varada for this extremely bracing session. And I'll hand it over to Reshmi now for a vote of thanks.
Yeah, sure. First and foremost, thank you to all the panelists and the moderator. We apologize for not being able to adequate time, which is why all of you prefaced your remarks with in the limited time that I have, right? But I hope this is just the first of many panel discussions that we would be having going forward. And apart from the kind of questions that there are really no quick answers to, very quickly, thank you in this limited slot of time for raising a large number of questions that have kind of triggered me to think forward. A challenge from Remli. Is this archive going to be a Borhean, Library of Babel, you know, with about a 10 raised to the power of 4677 potential answers to every search. Yes, I'm not sure we want to go there, right? So, though Varda says, we would like to include everything. Everything is a mind-boggling figure in today's world, however much of a thin cut of that slice you want to take. So these are things I don't have ready-made answers to, but I have a feeling that many of us that are going to be working, like I said, this launch is just the beginning of a long journey. We will have to make those difficult trade-offs. And another very provocative question from Ravi. I mean, if you are accessing 300, 400-year-old material, do you have the commitment to continue to work on this archive for 300 to 400 years? Well, ethically, yes, right? Can I promise it? No. But hopefully, institutional structures like ours should be able to make that commitment, because clearly it goes beyond the generation of one lifetime. I'll keep my remarks brief. I also remember a comment being made and a story being told to us that the real business happens over lunch and tea. So after we officially close this session, I'd like to welcome all of you here to join us for tea outside, where if we have not been able to give you the time to, interact with the panelists with your specific question, please feel free to do that. I'm sure they would be happy to engage on that. Before I close with that in caps quote, in the interest of time, I'd like to thank not just every constituent of the Azim Premji University, particularly the School of Education, the Continuing Education Program Department, and all our field district and state institutes. The value of an archive, we believe, is in its usability. And while it's not a number game in terms of how many people accessed it, it is definitely, and we are loudly and clearly hearing the message that it's not just a resource for researchers, it needs to be actively used in the classrooms and teacher education workshops and so on. More interestingly, it needs to be something that's not, sort of overwhelming to just a curious citizen who wants to know the history of his nation, maybe, So yeah, these are difficult things to deliver on, and certainly don't want to keep it in the cloud space as things that I have said. But we will definitely work together to make sure we deliver on these to the maximum extent possible. Finally, I'd like to wind up with a thank you, a very deep felt note of gratitude to each and every member of the Knowledge Resource Center, present and past. Having put all this together, I know the dedication and the long hours and painstaking specialization that these team members have brought into just this whole process of, supporting Varda once he identifies the collection, to actually acquire them in a physically safe way, to digitize them, to classify, catalog, figure out the metadata, make sure some of these are going into research notes. And I don't want to get you into the kitchen of the archives, everything that we need to do to make sure the dish comes out. But thank you, all members of KRC, for all those long hours of work that you have put into making this possible. For being able to share this archive with a wide public, we have relied heavily on each and every member of our communication team. So I'm not taking names of anyone, but you all know who you are. This event, the YouTube channel, the posters, and the continuing set of events you've planned for us, which is not just here, but in at least another 15 to 20 cities across India, where we plan to take traveling exhibitions and similarly have discussions and panel sort of deep dives with local resources as well. We look forward to the continuing support of the communications team. And I don't want to even call them out, but the university and our Azim Premji Foundation units in the field, and what is for that matter, for putting the germ of the idea in our heads. Thank you so much for working with us. It's a joint project, and I'm sure we can take it forward, right? Thank you. I'll keep the thank you shorter than the introduction. So let's all move to tea and take any other questions that we would like to ask our panelists. Thanks a lot.